Well, here we have a look at one of the most influential cars in modern history, and that is the 1976 to 1979 Cadillac Seville, and this being a beautiful example of a 1976 version. You can tell that in a few ways by looking at this picture, one of which is the egg crate grille up front that was unique to 1976, and by 1977, Cadillac had gone to a more vertical theme a la Rolls-Royce at the front of the vehicle. It also has that script Cadillac logo above the driver's side bright headlight that was only there for that particular year. As I mentioned, 1976 was the first year for the Cadillac Seville. It was introduced midway through the 1975 calendar year. So it had an early start on the model year overall and ended up selling 44,000 units in the 1976 model year. It was a tremendous runaway hit, and perhaps for a number of reasons. Cadillac dealers by this point had been clamoring for a vehicle that was more international in size, i.e. smaller than its typical large luxury offerings. For example, the 1976 Cadillac DeVille rode atop a 130-inch wheelbase and measured about 230 inches in overall length. That's just 10 inches shy of 20 feet long. The Seville, in contrast, rode atop a stretched Chevrolet Nova chassis. Yes, there is a Nova chassis, shall we call it, not a full frame, but a chassis underneath this Seville that was heavily modified. We'll talk more about that in a second. But it was a 114.3-inch wheelbase, and the Seville measured 204 inches in overall length. So it was 26 inches shorter, i.e. 2 inches more than 2 feet shorter than a Cadillac Calais or DeVille. It also weighed significantly less. The DeVille by this point was quite the porker at 5,000 plus pounds. The Seville was also not exactly a lightweight, but it weighed only 4,230 pounds in the 1976 model year. And yet the Cadillac buyer certainly didn't pay by the pound when it came to the overall lineup, as the Seville was the most expensive model of all those in the Cadillac showroom, excluding the Fleetwood 75. It carried a base price of $12,479, which was a pretty stiff premium over any other Cadillac in the lineup. The Eldorado stickered at $10,586, the DeVille in sedan form stickered at $9,265, and the price-leading Calais in sedan form stickered at $8,825. So the Seville represented a $3,200 premium versus the DeVille and about a $2,000 premium versus the Eldorado, despite its smaller size. The Seville also had a number of styling traits that it exhibited that were different from other Cadillacs of the past. The first you can see in the side view is that the Seville had these very round wheel arches, which would also be carried into the next generation, the Bustleback. But Cadillacs of this era and before often had square wheel arches, and Cadillacs after that, to be honest, too. It also had a very formal roofline with this stiff backlight or rear window and a consequently stiff sail panel or C-pillar back there. This was a styling trait that GM would use for many, many years to come across numerous vehicles. Most notably, a car that was introduced in the next model year, the 1977 Caprice and Impala, as well as that entire GM full-size vehicle lineup would use this type of roofline for years to come. And GM would even use it on a number of front-wheel drive vehicles, everything from the X cars to the A cars to the C and H cars. It became so overused, in fact, that when the 1986 Ford Taurus came out, it looked so different than what anything GM was producing that perhaps some buyers just flocked to it because it was so different, and this styling theme had been overused by General Motors stylists. You can also note that the Seville doesn't really have a distinct rear fender form or fin. It does have this sort of blocky-like taillight, but it doesn't have the fin that the full-size cars have with the full vertical taillight. And that would be something that I suppose the subsequent Seville designers would take advantage of when they design their vehicles, because the Bustleback Seville from 1980 to 1985 didn't have vertical taillights. In fact, had these very thin horizontal taillights, although a vertical theme was indeed tried, as you can see here, on that Bustleback Seville. Then in 1986 to 1991, the Seville also didn't have vertical taillights, and even the 1992 Seville, when it was introduced, didn't have vertical taillights. So Cadillac designers really exploited this Seville's lack of that vertical theme in the rear to their advantage, and I think it was honestly for the better. Here's a close-up of that rear taillight. You can see it wraps around the corner and serves the purpose of a side marker light in addition to a taillight, something that the vertically oriented rear-wheel drive cars couldn't do. They had to have a separate side marker lamp in the rear. So this was both clever and cost-effective, shall we say. And it did have the interesting Cadillac logo in the middle of it that was sometimes used during this period, as opposed to just the standard wreath and crest. And one more shot of the rear here so you can better see those tail lights. But also notice that the deck lid height on the Seville is pretty low. There's not much deck lid height here to speak of. And consequently, the trunk volume on this 1976 to 79 Seville is pretty small, especially given the spare tire has to fit in there. In fact, the trunk just had about 14 cubic feet of interior volume, which was typically the minimum requirement that GM had for its luxury cars during this time frame. The larger DeVille had about a 20 cubic foot trunk, so you could fit far more golf bags or dead bodies in the back of your DeVille versus the Seville. But the car did look good despite that. And a close-up of the deck lid lock cover. This swings out of the way to put your key in to open the trunk. You can see it's the typical wreath and crest of the time. And often people refer to those as ducks in the Cadillac logo. They are not ducks, but in fact merlets, or feetless birds from French heraldry and mythology. So they have a bit different symbol and connotation than just if they were a duck. And now turning to the interior of this 1976 Seville, you can see that despite the fact this car carried a $12,479 base price and could be equipped with numerous options, including guidematic headlamp control, twilight sentinel, theft deterrent system, wire wheel locks, illuminated entry system, etc., which often ran the sticker up even further, all of the interior wood grain is fake everywhere. And I guess it's better that it's fake, at least this 1976 version of fake wood, versus the later years where it went to a faux burl walnut trim that just really looked awful. But aside from the fake wood trim, it was a relatively rich interior. The instrument panel theme borrowed heavily from the 1974 to 76 DeVille and didn't really have all that great of materials either. It's somewhat soft touch, I would say. It does have the warning lights in a band above the speedometer there. So it's pretty similarly themed, as I mentioned, to the full-size cars. But the materials really aren't that great. It does have nice leather seats. The door panels are richly padded and appointed. The accelerator and brake pedal are nicely trimmed. The carpet is a nice, deep pile carpet. But I would say there's certainly some things that are left to be desired in the Seville's interior, and one of which is interior roominess. You can get a sense of what I'm talking about from this particular interior shot, where notice that the overall width is not all that great in this Seville, and there's not much legroom either. In fact, that footwell area for the driver and the passenger, especially with the litter container on the passenger side, is pretty narrow when you consider the rear-wheel drive transmission hump in the middle. I'm about 6 feet 1 inches, and I used to own a 1979 Seville diesel. And I can tell you that the interior felt a bit overstuffed. The seats were so poofy and the door panels so poofy and thick that it took away from the feeling of overall interior space. That said, the seats were relatively comfortable, and you did have good sightlines out the car. It didn't have a wraparound front windshield like the full-size General Motors vehicles did of the year, but certainly could see well out of it. And while the Seville did have rather standard Cadillac switchgear in a number of areas, including, you can see here, the power door lock switch, the window switch, and the seat controls, and the mirror control were also pretty standard fare. It did have this strange rotating style door lock button that you see on the armrest here that would rotate back and forth depending upon whether one locked or unlocked the door. And despite looking strange, it was rather functional and worked quite well. You just push on the one side of that button to either lock or unlock the door. And like I said, very functional, but something you didn't really see on the other Cadillacs of the era that had the standard plunger type door lock. Drivers of the 1976 Seville and the other Cadillacs from that model year sat behind this three-spoke steering wheel, which was used not only on Cadillacs, but a number of Buicks and even the GMC motorhome, although on the GMC motorhome, it obviously was devoid of any emblem in the middle. They didn't put a GMC in the center of that wheel. They did on the Buicks modify it slightly for that application, but just find it funny, this wheel was introduced in the Cadillacs and then later kind of spread to other GM divisions after a few years. The Seville did get Cadillac's automatic climate control standard. You can see with the rotary temperature wheel up top, and then a number of settings at the bottom, including an economy setting, which is somewhat humorous on a luxury car, but that disengaged the air conditioning compressor, which was engaged in all of the other settings all of the time, unless the temperature dropped below about 32 degrees. So hence the economy position. Save a little bit of gas in your luxury vehicle. You can also see this car does have a cruise control on-off switch there that you had to flip up before pushing the end of the cruise control. In later years, they'd actually make that a three-position switch where you could put it between off and then cruise and then on. If you had it in the on position, then the resume and acceleration feature would be enabled. If you had it in the cruise position, those would be disabled. Not quite sure why they did that, perhaps because the resume and acceleration feature were relatively new, but Cadillac did do that. You can also see that this car is not equipped with the Twilight Sentinel or Guidematic headlamp control, which would be attached to the overall headlight control here with knobs that you could turn to select either the delay for the headlight turn-off on the Twilight Sentinel or the distance at which you'd want the automatic bright lights to dim. Under hood in the Seville sat something that was sacrilege to Cadillac customers at the time, and that was an Oldsmobile-derived 350 cubic inch V8. You can tell it's an Oldsmobile V8 pretty easily just by looking at the oil fill tube there in the middle and the air conditioning compressor off on the passenger side. All Cadillac V8s of this era had the air conditioning compressor in between the V-bank in the middle of the engine. And presumably Cadillac shoehorned this Oldsmobile 350 in here because the Cadillac 500 was just too large physically of an engine to fit in here. It really was all that much bigger. Remember, the Olds 350 was a small block, the Cadillac was a big block, so I don't believe that the big block engine fits in here easily. And you can see this 350 is a pretty tight fit as well, especially with all the air conditioning and emissions components. Now, the Olds 350 in this car was equipped with a Cadillac exclusive electronic fuel injection system that was computer controlled, and it was a port fuel injection system, not a throttle body injection system, so it was quite advanced for the time. In this form, this engine made 180 horsepower, so not all that great, but good enough to propel the Seville 0 to 60 in a little over 10 seconds, which isn't bad given the 4,200 pound plus weight. You can also see on the driver's side near the front of the car, in front of the washer bottle, that is the automatic level control compressor. It was vacuum operated in 1976. In later years, that would become an electrically operated compressor, which was, I would say, more reliable and also one that made less noise. Certainly made no noise when it was turned off. And for what it's worth, though this was an Oldsmobile source 350 cubic inch V8, Cadillac allegedly built it to different standards and more exacting tolerances. Not quite sure if that's true in reality or not, in part because, at least from my opinion, Cadillacs were not built to the same standard as Oldsmobiles during this time period, so maybe that wasn't necessarily a good thing. Nonetheless, this engine was quite reliable, certainly more reliable than the Olds 350 diesel that would be placed under hood beginning in the 1978 model year. Lastly, you can indeed see a vestige of the Nova here, and that is the rear leaf spring suspension. Very different from the other Cadillacs, which had full coil suspension, except the Eldorado, which had torsion bars up front and coil springs in the rear. The Cadillac Seville did not have a full perimeter frame. It did have subframes, front and rear. Again, it was Nova-based, but the car had so much different that it actually got its own body name designation from General Motors, including the wheelbase being different. But Cadillac really did put a lot of effort into making this car something other than a tarted up Nova. using everything from fast Fourier analysis to analyze body squeaks and creaks and eliminate them, and a lot more sound deadening in the cabin to make this car much more hushed when traveling at speed in particular. And I would say, having owned one of these cars, they really were successful. This car does not drive like a cheap car, and in fact, it's quite a pleasant drive, especially with the relatively quick variable ratio power steering in these that varies the ratio from anywhere of around 13.5 to 1 to 16 to 1, depending upon where you have the wheel turned. It is a pleasant driving car and really does drive like a nice luxury car with a bit stiffer suspension than the DeVilles and Eldorados of the era, but very pleasant overall. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on this particular 1976 Seville. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.